Thank you to all of you who came back today for the last couple of lectures. I know it's probably been a long process for you, but I appreciate your patience and your resilience. So yesterday we talked about the history, the early history of development economics, as I said, at the center, that is within the developed industrial societies from the Western world, within the post-war environment. So I try to give you a sense of how development economics developed as part of the general framework of post-war science, of post-war social science, and of course, of post-war economics. So for this lecture today, what I wanted to do is to sort of flip the coin, so to speak, and tell you a little bit about this story from the reverse perspective. That is, from the way it was seen, it was acted, it was elaborated, and it was developed by economists that were themselves situated within what came to be called the periphery of capitalism. And so for this lecture, the Latin American bias that I talked to you about yesterday will come out certainly much stronger than yesterday. Again, this is going to be a story pretty much about a tradition, a school of thought, a series of authors and economists that developed a somehow original approach to the problems of development in Latin America during the 1950s and the 1960s mostly. In my defense, what I can say is that this so-called Latin American structuralist school, which is going to be the main object of our discussion today, is recognized not only by myself, but by most of the secondary literature on the subject as the most important contribution to development economics to come from outside of the developed world. That is to say, to come from underdeveloped regions themselves. So if there's a bias, the bias is not only mine, the bias is shared by a lot of people. So that's at least something that I can say on my defense. But before we delve into the topic for this particular lesson, I wanted to come back to where we stopped yesterday. There was some issues that I wanted to have broached as in closing the argument that I presented to you in yesterday's lecture. So I want to come back to that because I think they give us an adequate bridge to the topics that we're going to discuss today, not only on this lecture, but in the following lecture as well. So when we come to the 1960s and we try to assess the state of development economics as it stood in the early 1960s, for instance, what we see basically is a scene of great optimism. So, for instance, on the more practical side, we see the United Nations, for instance, declaring in 1961 that the 1960s would be the decade of development, in the sense that the United Nations would be compromised with a broad-based program to assist in the development of the third world nations. So there's this very, very, very ambitious and very, again, optimistic, practical program that envisioned the possibility of, within a decade, significantly reducing the problems of underdevelopment that had so far plagued these nations. And on the more theoretical or academic side, we also see a lot of the protagonists, even though there are some doubts and some hesitations that start to come up. We also see a lot of optimism among some of the most important players in the field of development economics. So a very, very symbolic example of that, for instance, is a very famous article that was published by Dudley Sears, who was the leading scholar in the Sussex Institute for Economic Development in the UK. That was titled "The Limitations of the Spatial Case," in which Dudley Sears basically provided an overview, an assessment, a retrospective assessment of the evolution of development economics so far until the early 60s. And his diagnosis was basically that there was a major revolution in doctrine looming ahead. And this major revolution in doctrine that he referred to was a doctrine that would install a new theoretical strand of economics that was concerned with development problems. So he basically equates this coming revolution of development economics to the recent Keynesian revolution, for instance. He even draws some parallels between the historical scientific process behind these two revolutions. So he's really optimistic in 1963 that development economics will serve as the launching base, so to speak, for a major doctrinal revolution in economics itself, in economics as a science, as an academic field. And the grounds for that revolution, as seen by Sears, have to do with the fact that what he saw as standard or mainstream economics up to that date was in fact only what he called the economics of the special case, in the sense that industrial developed nations were really just a small part of the world experience in terms of economic actions, of economic processes, of economic systems. And so what was needed was an economic science that was capable to deal not only with the special case of developed industrial economies, but also with the broader case, the broader varied case of underdeveloped economies with their different configurations, their different specificities and particularities the world over. So that's the revolution in doctrine that Sears sees as imminent, as something that's coming. And the way Sears frames his interpretation of this recent history of economics and of development economics is basically by saying that the great virtue of development economics is that it would provide an alternative both to neoclassical economics as it existed then and to Marxist economics. You know, we saw both these strands as excessively deterministic, as excessively concerned with predetermined linear historical progressions. Of course, they were these processes, these historical processes were understood differently by these two different strands, but still they converged in the sense that they basically understood history and modern history, contemporary history, as a path that led to a very clear endpoint, be it convergence and industrialization spontaneously produced by the market in the case of neoclassical economics, or socialist and communist revolution in the case of Marxist economics with the eventual, sorry, I forgot the word, the superation of the capitalist system. I ask you to bear this in mind because we're going to come back to this point later on. We're going to see how in the case of Latin American development economics, even though, of course, the emphasis are different, the terms of reference are a little different, still this idea of providing an alternative to the extremes of neoclassical economics on one side and Marxist economics on the other side is also a very important defining thread in this literature. The problem is that as the decade wears on, as the 1960s advance, the situation starts to change very rapidly. And the image, of course, that you see projected in the slide is meant as a symbolic representation of these changing conditions that are taking place not only in the United States, but of course the world over. And of course, some of these changes, as the war in Vietnam exemplifies, they had to do with changing perceptions precisely about the relationships between the United States, or between the developed capitalist world and the third world. And so they put into question a lot of the rationale, a lot of the rationalization that had so far sustained the discourse of development economics at the center, as I said yesterday. So of course, this is a very, very diverse and very broad process. It involves, for instance, a lot of setbacks that took place in the underdeveloped world and that would put into question, for instance, the liberal premise that we discussed yesterday that sustained modernization theory, the idea that all good things go together. So you start seeing in the third world experiences where on one hand, you have economic growth that is being accompanied by political repression, by military coups, by authoritarianism, and consequently by social disruptions, by the deteriorating conditions in income distribution, for instance. And so you see that, well, you can have one thing, you can have one good, you can have an economic good and still be cursed with several other bads, with political bads, with social bads, with cultural bads. And so these experiences, the results of some of the initiatives that were pursued during the 50s and 60s within the field of development economics are going to put into question a great deal of the optimism that was typical of the field early on. Another important point that will come up, and we'll see that in the next lecture very, very markedly. I'll try to give you some more concrete examples of how these new conditions reflected some of the programs that were pursued in Latin America by the United States. It's an increased scrutiny of what I described to you yesterday as the political, military, scientific complex that was put in place after World War II, especially in the United States. So insofar as the social sciences are concerned, I talked to you about yesterday about MIT's Center for International Studies and the fact that that center had been covertly funded by the CIA since its inception, but those connections were not publicly revealed until the late 60s. And so during the late 60s, I'll talk more about this later on in this lecture and the next lecture. There are several cases, similar cases of these at least questionable and sometimes openly debatable and nefarious connections between the political establishment, the military establishment, and the scientific establishment that are that will start to put into question some of the conclusions, some of the implications that had been produced by social scientists working within this broad framework for the past couple of decades. And of course, development economics, insofar as it was very strongly connected with modernization theory in the United States, was a strong target of attacks of this nature, both inside the US and outside the US in the third world itself. And of course, the deteriorating economic conditions from the late 60s onwards, but especially during the first half of the 1970s with the oil shocks and all the story that you probably know very well, of course, also put into question some of the more material underpinnings of development work. So the open and very plentiful flow of resources that had been channeled, for instance, during the 60s, first by Kennedy and the Alliance for Progress, but later continued also by the Johnson administration. That largesse from the US and from the first world in general will, of course, be checked by the strong deterioration in economic conditions that we see from the early 1970s onward. And that also will lead to a lot of soul searching and a lot of retrospective assessment about the merits and demerits of the developmental programs that were put in place during the 50s and 60s, and from then onwards to a search for alternative programs that could be more targeted and thus require less resources, but could produce more effective and more satisfactory results from the point of view of the donor countries. So again, it's a very broad process. We'll talk about some of the specific characteristics of it later on, but I think it's important to have the broad picture from the start, because this will be important for us to close the story towards the end. So when we again flip the coin and we look for the other side of this process, from the way that knowledge about economic development and the search for intellectual frameworks that could provide the rationale for more conscious developmental strategies in the periphery of capitalism, outside the center, outside the developed world, but in the third world itself, we see, of course, a story that could very easily be told as a story of intellectual emancipation, the search for alternative frameworks, the search, the attempt to disentangle oneself from interpretations, from theories, from hypotheses that had been formulated in the developed world, and that tended to reproduce some of the biases and some of the prejudices that were typical of the first world worldview. And so this, again, is a very easy story to tell, and it's a story that's been told many times in different ways by different people. Development economics at the periphery as a process through which some of the marginal voices in the process of development could finally be heard. They could finally find a platform on which their own ideas and their own perspectives could be taken seriously and could be served as the input for a more deep, a more encompassing assessment of their predicament. Of course, if we go back in time, we can find predecessors to the peripheral approach to development economics in the 19th century, in the late 18th century even. Alexander Hamilton, the report on manufacturers in the United States, the birth of the so-called American system of political economy, protectionism. Friedrich List, of course, in Germany later on in the mid-19th century. So there are a lot of predecessors, and some of them have been even claimed by Latin American development economists themselves as influences, as important intellectual points of reference for their own work. But I think there is one more direct line of descent that we can trace from the late 19th century through the interwar period all the way to the emergence of Latin American structuralism in the post-war era. That involves the dissemination of a set of ideas that were originally associated with the Russian Narodnik movement, something that you obviously know much better than I do. So I won't even venture to enter into any details about that. I'll just say that this movement and all the populist movements that were associated with it during the early 20th century, and especially during the interwar period in Eastern and Central Europe, they involved the search for a different economic framework, a different political economy that would take the peasant household and peasant forms of economic production as their core. So instead of looking for industrialism and instead of looking for, again, the patterns of development that had been followed by the early industrial nations, this movement involved the search for a semi-utopian alternative that would involve small-scale production. And so in this sense, it's a very important precursor to the later Small is Beautiful movement, for instance, that gained a lot of strength from the 1970s on with the work of V.F. Schumacher, for instance. So these movements, Alexander Shayanov, the Russian theorist that you see projected in the slide, of course, was a very important intellectual resource within this tradition. It was gradually disseminated during the interwar period throughout Eastern and Central Eastern Europe, and it was especially important in Romania, in interwar Romania, where a very important early source for developmental ideas that will later be rescued and reframed in Latin America was a very active public figure, Mihail Manoilescu. So Manoilescu, he was inserted in this Romanian context in which populist ideas and neo-populist ideas were very strong. He was even a member for some time of the Romanian National Peasantist Party. So he was politically engaged with the populist cause in Romania. But as time went on, he started to develop his arguments more towards a defense of a strategy for industrialization in the case of an agrarian country like Romania at the time, that would involve the gradual transfer of the surplus population from the agrarian sector to a modern industrial sector that would operate with increased levels of labor productivity, because it would be, of course, more capital intensive, and this could gradually reduce, or at least minimize the deprivation that was so characteristic of the agrarian population at that time in those areas. So again, we see in Manoilescu already some of the arguments that will be later developed during the post-war years. We talked about some of these ideas yesterday when we discussed Lewis, when we discussed Rosenstein-Rodin and other development economists. Rosenstein-Rodin, remember from our discussion yesterday, his classic 1943 article was about strategies for the development of Eastern and South Central Europe. So that was the world that he was concerned with. Of course, his concern was inserted in a larger preoccupation with stability in Europe, and of course, those recently emancipated areas were seen as particularly prone to imperialistic adventures from other European powers. But again, his terms of reference were those, and so the problem of how to bring overpopulated agrarian economies and overpopulated agrarian societies more firmly into the fold of the Western capitalist world was something that was obviously a very important concern at the time. It's possible, I'm not sure, that José Luis Cardoso mentioned Manuelescu to you in his lecture from a few days ago, because Manuelescu was also a very important theoretician of corporatism during the interwar period. And he was especially influential in the Iberian Peninsula, in Spain, in Portugal, and that's how his ideas actually made its way to Latin America, to both Chile, Brazil, Colombia, and other countries in Latin America, where Manuelescu was published, and he was very widely read during the 30s and especially the 40s. So here again, we see a very strong connection. This is an argument that was very, very well made by Joseph Love, an important historian of development economics in a classic book from 1996, Crafting the Third World. So you can see a very strong, a very clear connection between the arguments that were developed by Manuelescu during the interwar years in favor of industrialization as a strategy for absorbing surplus population from a traditional backward economic sector, and the platform that would be more fully developed by the ECLA school from the 1950s onwards. So the ECLA school, for those of you who have never heard of it, is a school of thought that is associated with the United Nations Economic Commission for Latin America that was created in 1948 as part of the new framework that was being established by the United Nations in the post-war world. And the commission, of course, as its name implies, was created specifically to deal with the problems of economic development of Latin America. It was one of many regional agencies that were created at the time. So we had agencies created for Africa, the Economic Commission for Africa, the Economic Commission for South Asia. But it was the only one that actually managed to develop a very explicit theoretical platform. So the other agencies, the way their work and their functioning developed, they were mostly concerned with applied technical work, whereas the ECLA agency actually gathered a group of intellectuals that had much higher ambitions, and so they set to work as a group and later individually into the development of an original theoretical interpretation of the problems of underdevelopment in Latin America and, of course, in the underdeveloped world more generally. So, of course, what we see in this tradition, in this large tradition that connects the Russian populism all the way through Manuelescu to the ECLA school in the post-war years, is the development of what it is an openly critical perspective. The idea that we need a theory of underdevelopment that will be different than the theory that was elaborated to explain the economic process and the economic functioning of the industrial developed world. Our problems are different, and so we need a different kind of theory, a different kind of interpretation. Well, one of the, Albert Hirschman is in his classic essay from 1979, I mentioned this yesterday as well, in which he tries to somehow summarize the history of development economics up to that time. He uses these two concepts or these two ideas as structuring features of development economics. The criticism of what he calls monoeconomics on one hand, the idea that there is only one economic theory that would be good and would be adequate for any kind of society, for any kind of economy. And on the other hand, the idea that there are mutual benefits to be obtained by the relations between developed and underdeveloped societies. So Hirschman is going to say, if you analyze the way that different schools position themselves towards these two questions, the questions of acceptance or rejection of monoeconomics and the existence or non-existence of mutual benefits, you can classify the field of development economics basically in four poles. And he says, well, development economics, as it developed as a scholarly field in the US especially, involves the rejection of the monoeconomics claim, but the acceptance of the mutual benefits claim. So there's the idea that we need a different kind of economic theory, of economic analysis to explain the problems of underdevelopment. But this does not necessarily imply that there are necessary conflicts of interest between the developed and the underdeveloped world. So there are mutual benefits that can be explored. And it's precisely this idea of the mutual benefits that's going to offer a sort of a starting point for the formulation of a peripheral alternative to the mainstream economics, the mainstream development economics discourse. So for people at the ECLA in the 1950s, it's precisely the premise that there are mutual benefits to be obtained by the relation between the developed nations and the underdeveloped nations that is going to come into closer scrutiny. At first, at least, this will not going to involve an explicit rejection of any possible mutual benefits, but it's going to involve a deeper exploration of what it is necessary to ensure that these mutual benefits can exist and can function in practice. So again, what we see here is a tradition of thought that's trying to chart an alternative path to, again, the neoclassical alternative on one hand and the Marxist alternative on the other hand. Of course, again, the preoccupations and the emphasis are different, but from the point of view of these Latin American scholars who are starting to develop their own interpretation, the neoclassical alternative is not enough, it's not sufficient, because it portrays, it pictures this idea of a developmental process that through international specialization, through international division of labor, and through the mutual benefits from international trade is going to gradually erase the gap, the income gap and the wealth gap between the developed and the underdeveloped world. So it's going to produce some kind of convergence. Whereas from the Marxist perspective, at least from the perspective of more traditional Marxist analysis from the early 20th century, either the problem of underdeveloped nations, of agrarian nations, for instance, is not really a relevant problem because the focus is, of course, on the industrial nations that are already closer to the conditions for a successful socialist revolution. But even in the cases of those who try to incorporate the underdeveloped world into a more systemic analysis of the capitalist system, these people will not really be concerned with finding strategies to alleviate the maladies, the problems, the deficiencies of the underdeveloped world, because they see any kind of palliative action in this regard, of remedial action in this regard, as something that is going to actually slow down the course of the revolution, because it's going to somehow improve the condition of the oppressed classes, and so make it harder for them to understand the real nature of their plight. So again, either for different reasons, of course, these both of these alternative theoretical paths, they did not offer the kind of approach, the kind of analysis that Latin American scholars in the post-war era, especially those associated with the ECLA school, were looking for. But of course, and this is a point that I want to stress with you, the fact that these people were speaking from the periphery and that they were, again, trying to find a stage where their marginal perspective could be heard and could be taken seriously, does not really mean that these people were complete mavericks that were, just developing these crazy ideas completely outside of any sort of institutional framework or institutional environment, and that they were completely autonomous in the development of their ideas. Quite the contrary, and I think it's important to stress this, the ECLA was a United Nations agency, so it was very firmly rooted in the institutional framework that was set up in the post-war world by the capitalist developed world. So, of course, we're talking about limited degrees of freedom here. And some of the critics of the ECLA school later on, the dependency theorists, for instance, in the 1970s and later, they're precisely going to point to that, to the timidity of some of the recommendations and some of the analysis that were developed by ECLA scholars, precisely because of these institutional constraints. The fact that there were some things that could be said, that could be tolerated within that framework, and other things that, of course, would probably be perceived as too radical or too extreme. And even the actors themselves, they were very far from isolated third world individuals who developed their ideas in a complete intellectual vacuum. Quite the contrary. Of course, we know that Raúl Prebisch, the most famous of the ECLA scholars from Argentina, he was a very well-connected individual who was very well placed in international intellectual networks, especially in the financial world. But there are many other cases we could cite as well. Juan Oyola, for instance, also a very important ECLA scholar. He worked at the International Monetary Fund for a few years in the late 40s before he joined the ECLA agency in Santiago. Celso Furtado, the Brazilian, also very famous structuralist scholar, not only he had studied in Cambridge, he had obtained his doctoral degree from Cambridge, he also went to work at the Yale Economic Growth Center in the United States in the mid-60s after he went into political exile from Brazil after the military coup, and then returned to Cambridge again to construct a career in a very important intellectual academic center at the time from the late 60s onwards. So again, we're talking about people who are very, very well integrated into the international academic elites. And so the idea that again, they were mavericks that were developing these ideas in complete autonomy and isolation from other people is a little bit distorting, and this is important to keep in mind as well. So when we talk about the CLA school, the one concept that certainly comes up more readily as a description of what is typical of the ECLA school, and in the picture you see the ECLA headquarters in Santiago de Chile. That's framed by the Andes Mountains in the back. It's a very beautiful building. The photo doesn't do justice to it. Actually, it's much more beautiful and impressive in person than it is in that picture. But so the feature that is most clearly associated, most immediately associated with the Latin American school is structuralism. So what does structuralism mean? It means a lot of things, and I'll talk about some of the meanings in a moment. But I think it's important to say at the outset that structuralism is not exactly a very formalized and systematic approach. So structuralism can manifest itself in different ways in different contexts. So it's much more a mind frame, a way of looking at problems that was used to understand certain issues, and whose practical implementation actually varied quite significantly from context to context. But one important characteristic of the structuralist worldview, so to speak, the structuralist approach to economic problems, relies, of course, in the very famous dichotomy that I myself have been using since the beginning of these lectures between the center and the periphery that was developed and disseminated by Prebisch himself during the late 1940s. So there's quite a lot of literature on that and how the concept was formulated by Prebisch. The first appearances of the concept in manuscripts and in notes is around 1944, but the first appearance in print of the concept is in 1946. And so people are going to talk about where he got this idea, what were his sources of influence. All of this is not really important for our concerns here. What's important is that once Prebisch presented this idea, this metaphor, we could say, as a way of understanding, of interpreting the relationships between the industrial developed world and the agrarian, traditional, backward, underdeveloped world. This idea caught on and became a very symbolic on one hand and very structuring of the Latin American economic discourse on the other hand. So what's original, we could say, about the idea of the center-periphery dichotomy is that it puts the relationships between the underdeveloped and the developed world very firmly within interpretation of the global economic system. So instead of thinking of the underdeveloped nations as simply nations that had not yet successively achieved the level of development of the first world, it put the focuses on the relations that had historically been developed between these nations all the way from the colonial times to come up with a more robust interpretation and understanding of how that came to be. how that peripheral condition was actually produced in practice by a set of economic, social, and political relations that placed a subset of the world's nations into a subordinate position vis-a-vis the industrial developed societies. And so again, what's interesting is that we see here for the first time in this lecture a reproduction in different terms, of course, in different with a different emphasis of the same concern with the existence of dualist structures that we discussed in yesterday's lectures. So in yesterday's lecture, I talked to you about how both Rosenstein-Rodin's ideas and Arthur Lewis's model, they're pretty much structured around the idea of economies that are marked by structural dualism, by the existence of sectors that function according to very different economic rules. And here what we see in Prebisch's center-periphery economy is a reproduction of that same idea. Not that he's copying from these authors, he's probably developing his ideas independently and from other sources, but it's the same mindset, identifying these dual structures, identifying dualities that help us understand how different regions of the world function according to significantly different logics. They're governed by different rules, by different structures, by different processes. And so this is a very important structuring element in the structuralist approach to economics. Structuralism, from that original analysis, that original metaphor, we could say, posited by Prebisch, it became gradually a whole methodological framework. Again, it became a way of looking at things. It became a way of understanding and interpreting economic phenomena. This methodological move, it drew a lot of its strength from other parallel processes that were going on in the social sciences at the time, and of course, functionalism in sociology, for instance, in the works either of Talcott Parsons in the U.S. or of Claude Lévi-Strauss in France, was a very important supporting element for the configuration of the structuralist worldview. So the idea that you want to understand social systems as complex relations of structures, of institutions, of functions that work together, that work as an ensemble. And so they have a sort of internal coherence that generates some kind of stability. So that way of looking at society, trying to identify social systems that are marked by functional relations that can generate stability, is of course a very important idea behind the structuralist approach to economics as well. But there is one important difference between structuralism as developed by the ECLA school and these more classic forms of structuralism, either in sociology or in anthropology, is that whereas these other forms of structuralism were basically concerned with statics, with the identification of social systems that were stable because they functioned accordingly, they were marked by these coherent functional relationships. The ECLA school, because it was originally geared from the start to the problem of development and to the problem of overcoming underdevelopment, it was obviously marked by a dynamic emphasis. So the concern was less with identifying the sources of stability in social structures, even though that, of course, was an important part of the endeavor, but it was more about identifying or coming up with strategies and policies that could transform those structures, that could move society from one set of social functional relations to a different set of social functional relations that could hopefully produce better results, either in terms of the economy, of society, of politics, and everything else. So this tension between statics and dynamics is something that's going to actually follow the development structuralism throughout its whole history. It's one of the defining characteristics of the school, at least in my view. And that because on one hand, we have this attempt to bring history back into the fold, to again leave behind the more static preoccupations of classical structuralism. And again, here I think it's important to establish, or it's useful to establish a contrast with what we discussed yesterday. So yesterday we saw how people like Walt Rostow, for instance, whereas they were also concerned with the problem of rationalizing historical development, rationalizing transformation in the structures of society, they were concerned, and Rostow, of course, is the most symbolic example of that, with tracing these unilinear paths of development, the idea that development is a trajectory that involves necessary steps. But of course, that's not the only way of looking at it. And we have other scholars in the US itself that are trying to come up with different ways of looking at this problem. And Alex Gerschenkron, who also is a Russian emigre, is a very important character in this story, because Gerschenkron was famous in the 1950s for developing the idea of economic catch-up. The idea that when you have a system that is marked by disparities in the levels of development between nations, the backward nations, the nations that were left behind, they have a model, they have a pattern that they can look to. And because they have this pattern, because they have this model, and because they have access to advanced technologies, for instance, that were developed very slowly by these early industrializers, they can come up with shortcuts that would produce alternative paths of development that would be different from the paths originally followed by the early industrializers, and that could hopefully be shorter, that could lead them to industrialization in a more efficient way, so to speak. So this is more in line with the approach that's being proposed and being advanced by the structuralists in Latin America. Searching for alternative paths of development that would make possible to take these shortcuts and to close the gap, to converge more rapidly, more quickly with the developed nations. So this combination of historical consciousness, so to speak, with concern with the existence of structures is what's going to give rise to what from the 1960s onwards is going to be described by many adherents to the CLA school as the historical structural method. It's a combination of both things. On one hand, it is a process of analyzing the structures that exist, the structures that are in place and that explain the functioning of these economies as they now exist. But it is also an approach that is concerned with understanding how these structures were produced in the first place, and hence how they could be changed, how they could be transformed in the name of some kind of developmental goal. So again, there's a tension, of course, between these two things. And this tension, it comes up very clearly in a lot of the structuralist literature from the 50s and the 60s, because on one hand, there's a very overbearing concern with rigidity, with identifying the sources of immobility that held these societies back, that impeded their developments. So understanding the structure, the social structure and the economic structure that was put in place in those societies as a way of identifying what are the barriers to development. What is it within these structures that is inhibiting development, that is functioning as a force to stability instead of change? And then possessed with that knowledge to identify what would be necessary or what would be adequate to actually introduce some kind of movement, to introduce some kind of change within those societies. But of course, when you combine these two things, the perception of of economic structures as these rigid systems that are marked by very deep-rooted relations and the need to change them, of course, what you come up with is a vision of historical process and historical evolution that's marked by discontinuities, because you're starting from the premise that the structure itself will not change by its own means. The structure will reproduce itself. It will not change itself. So to change the structure, you need to act consciously upon the structure. And so this is a historical discontinuity that has to be produced by certain actors. And of course, the state here comes up as the most important, the most well-positioned actor to introduce these necessary changes in the structures that exist in underdeveloped societies. So again, as I said, the structuralist method, it comes up in different places, in different guises, as part of different types of arguments. I will briefly talk about some of them, some of the most symbolic, some of the most significant examples of the structuralist method in practice. And of course, the most representative of them all is in the analysis produced by ECLA, by the ECLA School of International Trade, and how the patterns of international trade affected the economic health, the economic conditions of underdeveloped societies. So what you see here in the picture is Raul Prebisch at CEPAL, speaking at a CEPAL event in the early 1950s. And Prebisch, of course, is the most important actor when we talk about the structural approach to international trade. So he was the one who formulated originally what later came to be called the Prebisch-Singer thesis, which is basically the idea that there is a long-term secular tendency for the deterioration of the terms of trade in favor of industrial nations, of industrial economies, and against underdeveloped agrarian economies that specialized in the exportation of primary products. So the Prebisch-Singer thesis is called like that because it was somehow jointly developed by Prebisch in the late 40s from a more theoretical perspective, as a way of rationalizing the problem with the international insertion of Latin American economies at the time, but also by Hans Singer, who was at the time working at the United Nations headquarters in New York, and he developed an empirical study of the long-term tendencies of terms of trade, and he identified empirically, or at least he thought he had identified empirically, the existence of these movement of the terms of trade, this tendency to the movement of terms of trade in favor of industrial products and against agricultural products. So that's why we call this idea the Prebisch-Singer thesis, because it was, again, developed theoretically by Prebisch and empirically by Hans Singer roughly at the same time, by the late 1940s, early 1950s. The Prebisch-Singer thesis is basically a critique of the principle of comparative advantages. The idea, the classical idea that became a neoclassical idea, that there is a pattern of specialization of international trade, that if followed according to the principle of comparative advantages, is going to generate mutual benefits to all the participants, to all the nations involved. This particular idea had been given a somehow more elaborate form in the late 40s by Paul Samuelson with the factor equalization theorem. So the idea that given certain assumptions, free trade, according to the principle of comparative advantages, would tend to actually equalize and reduce the gap between the remuneration of factors of production in all the countries that participated, or all the economies that participated in this system of international trade. So again, it was an argument for convergence, the idea that if you liberalize trade, the difference in the wage levels, for instance, between agricultural producers and industrial producers is going to gradually decrease by the functioning of the mechanism of international trade, changes in relative prices in terms of trade, etc. So the Prebisch-Singer thesis was actually a criticism of that kind of idea. And the way that theoretically the argument was constructed was first, and this is how it came to be more widely known in the 1950s and later on, is due to the difference in the income elasticity of demand for industrial products and agricultural products. So there's the idea that as countries become richer, as societies become richer, they spend more money on industrial manufactured products and less money on agricultural products. So the income elasticity of these two different types of products is going to differ. And if your society specializes in the product that has a lower income elasticity and hence imports all the products that have a higher income elasticity, as time passes, as time moves on, and as both societies get wealthier, your products are going to be worth less than the products that you are importing from your partners in international trade. So that's the more popular version of the idea behind, the theoretical idea behind the Prebisch-Singer thesis, but it was actually developed at a much more detailed and sophisticated level of analysis by Prebisch himself Prebisch, I think it's important to emphasize, he was originally concerned with the problem of business cycles. So he was trained academically as a theorist of the business cycles during the interwar years, during the 1930s. And so his main concern was to understand how business cycles that originated in the center of the capitalist world were propagated to the periphery. So how the periphery, being specialized in the production of certain products and hence depending for its level of income on a steady flow of exports, how did the periphery absorb these fluctuations that originated in the industrial center of the capitalist system? And so that's how Prebisch approaches the issue. And because of that, the way he frames the question is to try to understand how these different economic structures behave in the event of cyclical fluctuations. And so Prebisch is going to say, well, there's a very important difference between the way the economies of the capitalist center work and the economies of the periphery work, because in the center, because again of the level of economic and social development, but also because of the types of products, the types of economic activities that are developed there, you have an economic structure that is much more oligopolistic. You have big industrial complexes that basically dominate the market. So they have a level of market power that's very, very strong, very marked. But these societies also have very strong trade union movements. So the labor interest is also very well represented. And so what happens is that when you have a downswing in the business cycle, for instance, this society manages to protect its interests much more effectively than the third world, where you have no trade union movement. You have actually a lot of surplus labor. So you have a lot of underemployment, as we discussed yesterday within the terms of reference of the Lewis model. And you have a lot of international competition. So you have a lot of different suppliers that are competing basically for the same restricted markets. So when the downswing hits, the center is able to preserve its income much more effectively than the periphery, because oligopolistic industries manage to control the market and restrict their production, for instance, to keep their prices up and hence keep their profit margins up. Whereas laborers also can resist wage reductions much more effectively than in the periphery. In the periphery, what you have is the opposite. So you have a reduction of labor incomes because there is no organized labor movement, and actually there's a lot of surplus labor available. And international competition is going to force prices down, and so the profit margins also are going to come down. And so because of that, you have an unequal distribution of the gains from trade, and especially of the gains from technological progress. And here's where the dynamic framework of the early structuralism comes in very strongly. So the argument here is this: well, and again, remember that Prebisch is thinking about business cycles, fluctuations across time. Of course, the argument of comparative advantage is an effective argument if you think statically, if you think in a moment of time, if you freeze time and you think about how should we organize production and consumption in a way to maximize global wealth, yeah, comparative advantages. But you put that into a dynamic framework and you understand the logic of business fluctuations and how these different economic structures react to these fluctuations, you see that over time, the fruits of technological progress are going to be unequally divided. They're going to be much more distributed towards the center than towards the periphery. And so that is an argument in favor of breaking out of this cycle, of introducing structural changes within your economy that is going to make you less dependent on industrial exports, industrial imports, and on agricultural exports. So you have to diversify your economic structure to be less vulnerable to these external shocks. So that's basically the argument that is going to be used as the main horse battle, we could say, in favor of the strategy, the policy strategy of import substituting industrialization, of which we already discussed yesterday. Of course, in practice, the way that import substituting industrialization took shape was basically as a form of modern protectionism, the introduction of import quotas, of differential tariffs that discriminated against certain types of industrial products that could be produced domestically, and a lot of other more refined and sophisticated instruments for the control of trade. But the main logic behind the platform, the political platform of import substituting industrialization, was that which came to be referred to within the ECLA school as inward-looking developments. So you have to dislocate the engine of growth from the export sector to the domestic market. So you cannot be entirely dependent on the demand that comes from abroad, that comes from the outside, that comes from the developed world as a source of effective demand for your production. So you have to have some kind of dynamism, some kind of engine of growth that is autonomous in the sense that it is based essentially on the domestic market, on the wealth that you can generate and consume within your own borders. A lot of people retrospectively have accused the ECLA school and especially the import substitute industrialization platform of being a modern form of mercantilism. And of course, there's some truth to that assessment or to that criticism. But it's important to understand that for the majority of these economists, and for Prebisch in particular, it was never about constructing an autarkic economic space, an economic space that would be entirely oriented towards the domestic market. So these people always understood that being inserted within the international trade networks was important for a sustainable development. So the matter was precisely how to change the domestic structure so as to make the most of your imports. So that's the main problem that's at stake. You have to change what they defined as the composition of imports. So instead of importing non-durable goods, non-durable industrial goods, or even durable industrial goods, you have to make room within your balance of payments to the importation of industrial raw materials, of capital goods, of those elements necessary for a successful process of industrialization and modernization that simply could not be obtained domestically. So it's a matter of shifting the composition of the imports and making room through the production of certain industrial goods within the economy to the importation of those goods that simply could not be produced domestically. So that's more or less the rationale behind, at least in its early stages, the import substituting industrialization platform. As time went on, and as the process of import substitution gained ground in Latin America, and this is something that actually went back all the way to the interwar period, you know, the economic history of Latin America, the traditional narratives are usually place the origins of import substitution in practice in the 1930s as a response to the great crisis of '29 and to the shifting international context, you know, to the closing of certain markets, certain European markets. But as the process of import substitution and the process of industrialization gained ground in Latin America, this gave rise to a different set of problems, but that in the end proved to be quite similar to the original problems that the strategy was supposed to have helped ease or correct a little bit. So when we talk about the way the ECLA discourse about international trade and industrialization evolved during this, throughout the 50s and especially during the 60s, we see that the concern with the external constraints to growth becomes ever more prominent. And the reason behind that is that as import substitution gained ground, you have the introduction of certain economic sectors that, instead of reducing the dependence on imports, actually increase that dependence. Because for certain industrial sectors, for the production of consumer non-durables, for instance, these sectors, they were extremely dependent on the importation of certain industrial raw materials and in certain capital goods, as I just said, that again were simply not available inside of these underdeveloped nations. And because of that, they introduced a strain in the balance of payments that was even more intense than before. So this is the origin of the concern that is very predominant in the Latin American structuralist literature during the 1960s, for instance, with what came to be called the two gaps that restrained or that impeded development and growth: the savings gap and the dollars gap. the gap in international reserves that could be used to import the necessary resources for sustaining the process of industrialization that had already begun. So again, this is a very important, a very widespread topic in the literature at the time, the development of these two gap models that try to somehow establish the formal relations, the more systematic relations between the restraints or the constraints that were imposed by balance of payments problems on one hand, and by the lack of domestic savings for finance industrialization on the other. So remember that last class, we talked about capital fundamentalism, and we talked about the idea that the main source of impediment to growth in underdeveloped countries was regarded as the lack of an adequate volume of savings that could finance accumulation of capital. So what we have here is the diversification of that idea. Yes, savings are important. It's important that we manage to extract a part of the social surplus and gear that to capital accumulation, but that's not enough, because capital accumulation only can be effectively implemented if we have access to the necessary industrial imports. So the dollars gap, the gap in international reserves, also becomes a very crucial consideration again, as the process of import substitution gains ground. And so what we have here is a restatement of the old center-periphery dichotomy in somehow different terms. Because if at first the strategy of import substitution was regarded as a way out of that perverse pattern of specialization that was seen as posing a ceiling to the possibilities of growth of underdeveloped economies, because precisely of the tendency of the terms of trade to deteriorate over time. Now what we have here is again an interpretation of the process of development and of deepening industrialization that made this process dependent on access to foreign resources. And so the export capacity once again becomes a crucial matter. So what can we do, and what do we have to do in order to have access to the international reserves that are necessary to finance the deepening of the industrial structure of the country? So again, what we see here is the idea, placed on different terms, that the rate of growth of the center, the rate of growth of the developed economies, actually functions as a ceiling on the possibilities of growth of the underdeveloped economies. Because if we depend on external demand for our own resources in order to obtain the reserves that are necessary to deepen our industrialization, if the center is not growing, at a rapid pace, we are not going to have access to those necessary resources. And again, the thesis of convergence is put in question one more time. So if there is a ceiling that is operative on the capacity, on the possibilities for growth and development in the periphery, and that is determined basically by the rhythm of growth of the center itself, how can we envision some kind of convergence? We need the center to grow first in order for the periphery to grow. So no kind of convergence seems to be feasible within that framework. And of course, here what we have is a sort of shifting of the emphasis, or a replacement of the emphasis insofar as foreign assistance and foreign aid programs are concerned, precisely with the making available the necessary international reserves for financing the dollars gap that came to be seen as a very important constraint on the growth of underdeveloped economies. So again, you see in this picture a much later repercussion of that conundrum. You know, what became a very important rally cry in Latin America, especially from the 1980s onward, and that reflects, of course, this idea of a financially constrained growth, and it's the idea that, well, the International Monetary Fund is the watchdog of the center that's here to keep us constrained and to prevent us from engendering our own autonomous and internally oriented process of development. So the Fuera FMI, IMF go away, became, of course, a very important rally cry related to those problems later on. Finally, the last point that I wanted to discuss with you in this lecture has to do with the implications of structuralist analysis to the understanding of the problem of inflation in underdeveloped countries, and especially inflation in Latin America. Of course, inflation was a very permanent feature of Latin American societies, of most Latin American societies throughout the entire post-war period. So from the 50s onward, you see, of course, with varying levels of intensity, these industrializing societies grappling with the problem of inflation, of increasing inflation. But there's a difference between, or it was perceived to exist a difference between the nature of Latin American inflation and the nature of inflation as it existed in developed countries. Because if we take, for instance, the Keynesian interpretation of inflation, inflation is basically a phenomenon that's produced by excessive demand when you reach a full employment level. So that's where inflation kicks in. But here we're talking about economies that are growing, that are actually going through a process of sustained growth, of robust growth. So, of course, these are not nations that are facing any kind of full employment ceiling, and yet they are forced to deal with problems of inflation. So how to make sense of that, how to understand the existence and the persistence over time of inflation in Latin America. So again, this was a very fertile ground for discussions, for arguments that permeated the entire 50s and 60s, and that in a way are still with us today. But what's interesting here is that we have already in the late 50s and early 60s the establishment or the configuration of this very clear opposition between two different approaches to inflation in Latin America: the so-called monetarist approach, monetarism, and the so-called structuralist approach. So again, and this is something that's been discussed in the literature, monetarism was actually born in Latin America much earlier than in Chicago. We already had our very well-defined monetarist school in the 1950s, people who identified themselves very clearly as monetarists. And this monetarist position, as it was perceived in Latin America, it had to do, above everything else, with the sort of stabilization policies and stabilization platforms that were advocated by the IMF for Latin American countries. So the IMF, of course, had its technical missions that came to Latin America every now and then to give advice, and the advices that were put forth by these technical missions, these assistance missions by the IMF, usually relied on some kind of interpretation of inflation as a demand problem. So it's either because the public sector is spending too much, you're running a public deficit, because you're investing in infrastructure, you're giving subsidies to industry, and because of that, you're creating a problem of excessive demand, and it's that demand pressure that is generating an inflationary trend. So that was sort of the orthodox monetarist interpretation as it appeared, or as it was understood in Latin America in the late 50s and early 60s. And in opposition to that orthodox interpretation, the ECLA school developed a different alternative interpretation that emphasized the existence of what they called structural causes for inflation. So those things that were seen by the monetarists as the origins of inflation, as the original causes of inflation, for instance, the public deficits that were run by the government, were seen by the structuralists as simply propagating mechanisms, as they were called. So it's because you have structural causes, and I'll talk more about these in a minute, that the society is forced to enter into the struggle for the distribution of income that puts in motion all these triggers, all these mechanisms, for instance, the running of public deficits or the indexing of wages or markups on costs and things like that, that will propagate inflation. But they are not the origin of inflation. They simply keep inflation going. They sustain inflation, but they do not cause inflation. The causes of inflation lie elsewhere. And so if you want to solve the problem, you have to strike at the structural causes and not at the propagating mechanisms. And of course, the political implication here is the idea that if you strike at the propagating mechanisms, not only you're not going to fix the problem, you're actually going to cause an even worse problem. Because as you adopt recessive, restrictive, depressive measures, you're going to stop, to put a brake on the process of growth and development. So that's the worst the worst thing that you could do. It's the worst policy that you could follow in the eyes, of course, of the structuralist analysts of inflation. So the structuralist interpretation of inflation basically posits the idea that inflation is a consequence of the process of growth itself, but of the process of growth as it existed in an underdeveloped economy, and hence an unbalanced process of growth. A process of growth that was not going to be disseminated evenly throughout the whole structure, that was going to be concentrated in certain sectors. And because of that concentration, it's going to put pressure on other sectors. And these sectors, some of them are going to respond well, and others are not going to respond well at all. And because some of these sectors that are not going to respond very well to these demand pressures that are generated by growth itself, then you have the emergence of what would be referred to as the supply bottlenecks. And of course, the most important supply bottleneck that was identified at the time was the agricultural production, because the agricultural sector was still marked in general terms by subsistence structures, by pre-capitalist modes of production. It did not respond well to the pressures of demand. So you have a very inelastic supply of foodstuffs, for instance. And because you have an inelastic supply of foodstuffs, as the economy grows, as the urban population grows, as the laboring classes grow, you have more wages, you have more people demanding food, the prices of food are going to go up. And because the prices of food go up, the prices of everything else are going to go up. So that's a structural cause of inflation. It's not, it's not the government deficit, it's not the practices of labor unions, it's none of that. It's the fact that you have an uneven economic structure that creates these bottlenecks and hence introduces a change in relative prices that then, through the propagating mechanisms, is going to be disseminated through the whole economic structure. Another source of these structural causes of inflation are exchange devaluations. We talked about the problems in the balance of payments that become more and more severe as the industrialization process goes on. And of course, one way of dealing with that, one way of dealing with the dollar gap, as I referred to a moment ago, is to engage in exchange devaluations to make imports cheaper and exports more expensive. And so when you do that, you introduce another inflationary shock in the structure of the economy that, again, through the propagating mechanisms, is going to be disseminated through the whole system. There is another argument that was very that was developed later on, especially during the 1960s, that has to do with the types of technology that were imported from the developed world to Latin America. And here, Celso Furtado, the Brazilian economist, is a very important player in this field. But the argument here is this: well, the problem is that because we are basically patterning our development by looking at what's happening elsewhere, we are importing technologies that are not really adequate to our own level of development. And so, for instance, we are importing technologies that are too capital intensive, whereas they should be more labor intensive, because the relatively excessive factor of production that we have here in Latin America is labor and not capital. So when we import capital intensive or excessively capital intensive technologies to implement our industrialization, we make these structures too big and too complex to operate efficiently, to operate at an economically efficient level with the domestic restricted markets that we have in Latin America, with these non-integrated economies that we have in Latin America. But more than that, we also reduce the capacity of these industries themselves to absorb the surplus labor. Because these technologies are capital intensive and not labor intensive, they employ much less people than they could. And so they are not as effective as they could in bringing the surplus labor, the people who are still in the subsistence sector, for instance, more firmly into the fold of the domestic market. So I'm running out of time, so I'm not going to talk about the inflation feeding versus inflation induced bottlenecks, because I think it's not that important. I'll jump straight to the later developments and later implications of this discussion about inflation, especially from the 1970s onwards. One of the arguments that was frequently mobilized by Latin American economists during the 50s in particular to justify inflation, to justify the tolerance towards inflation, was that inflation was actually, in certain circumstances, an effective and useful instrument to transfer savings from one sector of the society to the other. So again, the idea is that the elasticity of demand for manufactured products is much, the income elasticity of demand for manufactured products is much higher than for agricultural products. And so if you let these prices be adjusted, the industrial sector is going to reap the major benefits of the inflationary process because it will be able to absorb the change in prices more satisfactorily than the agricultural products. And through that, what you're doing is basically transferring savings from the agricultural primary sector to the industrial sector that was perceived, of course, as the engine of growth, and hence the sector that was in charge of keeping up with the process of capital accumulation. So this was an original argument, but as time went on, people started to realize in practice, empirically, how this actually gave rise to a very skewed industrialization, a very skewed industrial structure, because what this process generated was a concentration of income in the hands, basically, of the industrial bourgeoisie and the urban elites. And of course, this industrial bourgeoisie and these urban elites, they were not demanders of mass consumption products. They were demanded of sophisticated products. And here there's a very important argument that was developed by Celso Furtado in the 60s and 70s that has to do with the idea of cultural dependence, because the domestic elites, they patterned their consumption after the cosmopolitan elite, so to speak. And so what they want, the products that they want, are products that are catered to a very, very narrow market. But because these people are the people who have the resources to buy products, that's where the industry is going to go. So you're going to have the development of a very niche, sort of an enclave industry that's geared to the demands of a very restricted class and whose possibilities of expansion, of actually catering to a mass market, are very reduced. So again, you have a process of income concentration that favors these new urban industrial elites. And that is self-perpetuating because that's where the effective demand is coming from. And so that's where the incentives to deepening and increasing industrialization also are coming from. And so again, you have the reproduction, and I'll close with this, of the same old duality arguments. So again, it's a different sort of duality, but it's the same logic. So within the same market, you have the creation of different economic spaces. You know, the industrial developed sector that caters to the elites, but that is restricted, of course, to a very, very narrow market. And the urban masses now, and no longer the subsistence peasants, but the urban masses that are now living, for instance, in the slums, the urban slums, who are completely excluded from the capitalist market and so cannot function as a source of effective demand and hence an effective engine to sustain the process of growth and development. I had, again, another slide. I'll leave it to the beginning of the next lecture so we can have a few questions to conclude this one. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Any questions? Yes, we have one, at least so far, in the chat from Ilke.
So the question is, what do you make of the argument that the Nixon shock of 71 has monopolized the international trade into American hands, and thus the letting foreign nations finance balance of payments deficits, which are precisely caused by US American military spending? And if so, what does it say about, in your opinion, a system which allows one nation dominating the economic and military activity in the world? Again, I mean, I don't want to talk about my own interpretation of this. I'm not a specialist in international finance. I'm not a specialist in macroeconomics to give you a well-substantiated argument. I'm going to tell you about how these people reacted to these phenomena. And I can tell you that was certainly a very, very, very important source of concern for these people. So a lot of people are starting to look at this process. And I would just give you a hint of what was coming in the next slide so that you can see how that is precisely what I was going to talk about. So you see here in this slide, this graffiti in a wall in Brazil in 1965, and it reads, for those who cannot read Portuguese, I guess most of you, it says basically, yesterday Vietnam, today the Dominican Republic. The Dominican Republic. Who is going to be the next victim of bloodthirsty Americans? So again, this reflects a very important inflection in politics, in public opinion, in values that's going on at the time, in the passage to from the early to the late 1960s. Again, 1965, for those of you who do not know, was the year when the United States actively intervened in the Dominican Republic to support a military coup that took place in that country. That was already in Lyndon Johnson's administration. And it was the first time in a really, really long time that the United States intervened directly, explicitly in a Latin American country. So, of course, that has a very important symbolic effect. And what it says, or one possible reading of what happened of those episodes is that, well, all of these people who have been trying to play the game in a civilized manner, and they have been trying to find strategies that would lead to development within the framework of the system as it is, these people have just been naive, because they were playing a game that was rigged from the start. It's a game that you just could not win because the cards are all stacked in favor of the other side, of the other player. So to think that through the inner workings of the system, you would be able to overcome those structural deficiencies that you identified to begin with is just, an illusion. It's something that never really corresponded to reality. And so that was certainly a very important concern for people who are reflecting on the new reality that was posed by the late 1960s. So you see, for instance, in Brazil, the emergence of what were later called as stagnationist arguments. So the idea that, yeah, we have basically reached our ceiling, we have reached the limits of what we could achieve within the logic and the workings of the system. And so if we want to move beyond this, we need to devise something else. We need to think of something else. To just keep playing this game is not going to take us anywhere else. So again, that's pretty much the change of mood, the change of climate that's taking hold at the time. I'm going to talk a little bit about that in the next lecture as well.